Tom, it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you again. Enjoyed our association when we were both in Kansas City.
Oh, it's great to be here.
When was the Kansas City field station actually begun?
It is not quite clear exactly when the Kansas City field station began. It probably began around 1949. At first, the station was known as Midwestern CDC Services. And as far as I could figure, it began in January, or the spring, in 1949.
Who was the first director of that field station?
Johnny Rowe. Johnny Rowe was an entomologist, and he was the first director of that CDC Services.
So it wasn't actually called a field station, it was called Field Services.
Right, it's called Midwestern CDC Services.
And what was the primary objective of that Midwestern Services?
One of the major units was on encephalitis, arbovirus encephalitis. And there was a great deal of encephalitides, particularly Western equine encephalitis, going on in the Middle West at that time. So I believe that the main function of that station or that services was on encephalitis, although there was a great deal of interest on histoplasmosis as well.
Was that part of the U.S. Public Health Service?
Yeah, that's part of CDC, part of U.S. Public Health Service.
And so it became a part of CDC right from the very beginning?
Yes, although there were some activities, Public Health Service was investigating tuberculosis from the tuberculosis program operated from Washington prior to that time.
The primary function of the field station, as I recall, was in the field of mycosis. Is that correct?
That was after the arbovirus activities moved to Greeley, Colorado. Then gradually Dr. Leo Furcolo assumed the directorship of the station, and then histoplasmosis was the primary investigative activity.
So the viral activities really left Kansas City, and then it was taken over by Furcolo, who began the studies in mycoses.
Right, histoplasmosis primarily.
What was Furcolo's major contribution, do you think, at that point?
Well, at that time, very little is known about histoplasmosis. Since his primary interest prior to that was on tuberculosis, and he found that many people around that area had calcifications in their lungs, in their chest X-rays, and many of these people were not tuberculin positive, and as a result of that, many of those cases were indeed proven to be histoplasmosis. So I think Dr. Furcolo really had made a tremendous contribution on the epidemiology of histoplasmosis in that area. Histoplasmosis prior to that was known to be highly fatal, and with his work on the epidemiology of histoplasmosis, it found that the histoplasmosis is rather a benign disease rather than a highly fatal disease.
So it really wasn't that histoplasmosis was a major problem in the Midwest until his work began?
That's right, until his work, his survey of histoplasmin, skin test surveys, and other investigation of outbreaks of histoplasmosis in the Kansas City area.
When did the viral studies begin in Kansas City? They actually had already been there first, but were transferred to Greeley, and then later on viral studies were added to the studies of fungal diseases.
Yes, I imagine the field station became the Kansas City field station somewhere around 1950. And it became a part of an epidemiology branch when Dr. Langmuir got the CDC. And that interest continued to be on histoplasmosis until I got there in 1954.
So the viral studies really with your arrival?
That's right, with my arrival. And when I got there, as you remember, there was a assault vaccine trial in 1954. So I was assigned to Dr. Herb Winter's laboratory at the University of Kansas, in addition to the Kansas City Field Station working on histoplasmosis. So I think that the interest in viral diseases began after I got there, particularly during the fall of 1954, and we had a big epidemic of encephalitis in Hidalgo County in Texas. And Leo Ferkano and I and others went down to Texas and investigated that outbreak of encephalitis that turned out to be the biggest outbreak of encephalitis since 1937, that is St. Louis encephalitis.
The Kansas City then was part of the epidemiology branch before you arrived?
Yes, I became part of the epidemiology branch in 1950, I believe.
What were your positions during your stay at Kansas City? You began as an EIS officer.
Right, I began as an EIS officer and assigned there directly to the Kansas City Field Station. And after my 2 years of duty as an EIS officer, then I was made the assistant chief of the field station. And subsequently, I was also made the chief of the respiratory and enterovirus unit, in addition to my duty as assistant chief of the field station.
And then later on, you became the director of the field station with Ferkalo's retirement, is that?
That's right. Leo Ferkalo retired in 1964, and I became the chief of that station.
And it wasn't long after that that the Ecological Investigations program began.
The Ecological Investigations program began 2 years later, in 1966. And I was asked by Dave Sensor to coordinate all the field stations of the CDC field stations in the United States. The only one, I guess, I was not coordinating was the Savannah field station.
So would you say that the rationale for forming the Ecological Investigations program was really the result of Dave Sensor's request that you take on the supervision of all the field stations?
That's right.
What was the reason for choosing that title for the program?
Well, the field station activities involve more than epidemiologic investigations. One of the field stations at that time was in Greeley. And then primary goal of that field station is to investigate arbovirus encephalitis. Of course, it involves a lot of ecology. As a matter of fact, they call that there was a disease ecology section. So when I was made the director of that program, there was a lot of concern about making the title just epidemiology, because there's so much ecological investigations were going on already in some of the other field stations. So with some negotiations, and we finally decided that it should be called ecological investigations, because the investigations centered not only on the epidemiological investigations, but on ecological aspects as well.
I remember that happened just 1 year after I joined your program in 1965, when I came as an EIS officer to Omaha, and then I went to Anchorage at the same time that the Ecological Investigations program was formed, and I remember there was a lot of interest in the whole field of ecology at that point. What would you say about the kinds of staff that you had at the Kansas City Field Station over that period of time, and the qualifications of the people at the Kansas City Field Station?
Well, the Kansas City Field Station, as you remember, had a variety of investigators. It's a multidisciplinary organization. We had epidemiologists, medical epidemiologists, microbiologists, and immunologists, statisticians, And we had laboratories in those stations. Of course, in other field stations, we had mammalogists, entomologists, parasitologists, and so on. But all the activities are integrated, ecologically, epidemiologically, and laboratory-wise.
What was the relationship to the University of Kansas? You were physically located right across from Kansas University Medical Center throughout the history of the field station? Did you always occupy the same buildings?
No. No, actually, at one time, the CDC activities was located on one of the university basic science buildings, adjacent to Dr. Winter's virus research laboratories. And it was on the 4th floor. And subsequently, I guess with the number of people gotten the station gotten so big, they acquired a Quonset building. There was a Quonset building located on the university campus, and when I was assigned there, I was in the Quonset building. So that I was there from 1954 until about 1960. Then we moved into a new building, and that new building was also on the university campus, adjacent to the old Quonset building.
And then later on, you added to that building in the early 1970s, as I recall, or late 60s.
Well, in the late 60s, about a couple of years after the ecological investigations program was formed, so that the initial field station opened in 1960, I think 2 or 3 years later. Then we add on to that laboratory.
What were all the different field stations that were included under Ecological Investigations Program, EIP?
Well, let me see. There are quite a number of them. I will have to stretch my memory a little bit. In addition to the Kansas City Field Station, which is the headquarters for the Ecological Investigations Program, we had a laboratory in Phoenix, a field station in Phoenix. And then the Colorado station originally was in Greeley, then later on moved to Fort Collins when the new laboratory was open. Then there's a laboratory in San Juan, Puerto Rico, working on schistosomiasis at that time. Then was a station in San Francisco, working on plague, and then we had a small unit in Hawaii, working on plague.
I didn't realize that you had units in San Francisco and Hawaii.
Yes, actually the plague station had been in San Francisco for many years.
Was it part of the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital, or where was it located?
It located next to the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital. It has a separate building.
When did that leave the CDC?
Well, we moved that after the Fort Collins laboratory opened. I imagine it was about I don't remember the exact date, probably around 1968 or so.
So that responsibility was transferred from San Francisco to Fort Collins.
That's right.
And what about the Hawaii?
The Hawaii unit was closed around that time as well. In addition, we had, I just remembered, we had a unit in Window Rock in New Mexico.
Doing what?
Working on plague as well, because there was the endemic area of plague is in New Mexico, actually around that area. So that we maintain a unit in Window Rock, not far from the Indian husband Gallup.
And you also had a field station in Anchorage later on. I guess you didn't really have a field station in Anchorage initially. When EIP was formed, you really just had a couple of officers assigned to the Arctic Health Research Center.
That's right. Actually, at that time, I was working with Jim Maynard when you were assigned there, 1965, I believe, and it was really under the direction of the Arctic Health Research Center.
That's right. I was the first EIS officer ever assigned to Alaska, as I understand it.
That's right.
In '65.
Interestingly, we had another unit, I forgot. we were quite big, bigger than most people realize. We had a unit in Cape Kennedy
For the space program.
for the space program. That's right. It's actually part of the Phoenix Field Station activities.
What was the rationale for pulling these all together out of the Kansas City field station?
Well, when Dave Sensor called me back in 1966, he felt that all field stations should be coordinated under one program by one director. And he felt that some of the investigative activities of some of the field stations should be upgraded and also better coordinated under, it would be much better coordinated under one director rather than under divisions or branches.
How did that work in your view?
Well, I think it worked very well. The Phoenix field station at that time was working primarily on diarrhea, and I felt that the work should be upgraded, and I recruited Jim Menard from Alaska to run that station. And as you know, that although they started out to work on diarrhea and among the Indians and other populations around the Arizona area, but eventually its main activities were on hepatitis. And I believe the Arizona, the Phoenix field station became so well known, actually internationally known in investigation of hepatitis A as well in hepatitis B. The Fort Collins field station was working primarily in arbovirus infections, and later on we moved the plague laboratories in there, and in addition to plague investigations we had streptococcus disease investigations as well, because rheumatic fever was quite prevalent in that area, in the Rocky Mountain area, so that we have a activities there as well. Then in Puerto Rico, in addition to working on schistosomiasis, we began to work on dengue as well, because dengue became epidemic in that area, in the Caribbean area. Then, as you know, we started to have a field station in Anchorage. The laboratory was built right on the ground of the Indian Health Service Hospital, and that the station investigated a variety of diseases. In addition to acute respiratory diseases, we investigated parasitic diseases as well. And later on, it expanded its activities on cancer. The working on nasopharyngeal carcinoma, working on hepatitis B, and so I think the activities of the Ecological Investigations program were very comprehensive, and is coordinated between the laboratory as well as between the laboratories in the field.
The Anchorage field station really began, I guess, after the Arctic Health Research Center was closed in around 1970. No, let's see. Actually, the Arctic Health Research Center moved from Anchorage to Fairbanks, didn't it? And that left only the epidemiology group in Anchorage. But it was about the time that Arctic Health Research Center closed that the Kansas City Field Station closed. The Kansas City operation in Anchorage really grew in collaboration with Arctic Health Research Center, I guess, didn't it, until about 1973?
Well, it's yeah, I think we work very closely with the Arctic Health Research Center, but the laboratory was established under under CDC before 1973, somewhere around 1970, I think. So that the Arctic Health Research Center sort of gave up their epidemiology activities and is sort of a transfer to CDC under the Ecological Investigations Program.
There was some transfer of responsibilities to the EIP programs, as I recall. For example, the arbovirus activities from Atlanta were moved entirely to Fort Collins, I believe. Isn't that correct?
That was done after the Ecological Investigations Program was terminated. That is, after the Kansas City Field Station was closed.
So it was an effort to consolidate some of the responsibilities and avoid duplication. Is that what would you say the reason for moving some of the activities between Atlanta and the field station back and forth was simply to try to avoid duplication and consolidate the efforts in those areas?
That's right, because there's the laboratory in Fort Collins was centered primarily in arbovirus investigations, and there are more arbovirus epidemics going around that area. They have arbovirus epidemics periodically in the Middle West, Western equine encephalitis. We have St. Louis encephalitis outbreaks going on in different places. And Texas and the Panhandle, it has it's an endemic area for St. Louis encephalitis and Western equine encephalitis. And the laboratory was big enough, I believe, that you could consolidate all arbovirus investigations into one laboratory. I believe that's the main reason to coordinate and integrate field as well as laboratory activities under one place, in one place.
What would you list as some of the most notable projects conducted by the Kansas City Field Station?
Well, the Kansas City Field Station, of course, the most prominent contribution of Kansas City Field Station was the epidemiology of histoplasmosis. And that, so no question, Dr. Ferkalow had contributed a great deal to the knowledge of that disease. But the other contributions, I think it's a quite notable. One is on the study of aseptic meningitis by enteroviruses. Now, the Kansas City Field Station really identified or provided information related ECHO4 to aseptic meningitis for the first time in 1955. Prior to that, they have isolated ECHO4 from only individual cases. And at that time, of course, there were so many enteroviruses known as orphan viruses. And as there was a symposium sponsored by the New York Academy of Science, known as a virus in search of disease. And we were able to provide information relating ECHO4 to aseptic meningitis for the first time in 1955. So I think that was a important contribution.
Polio was a major effort as well, wasn't it?
Well, that came a little bit on. Came a little bit later, but in 1966, another year was a big year of Coxsackie B5. It was causing epidemic throughout the United States. And here again, we were able to provide information relating Coxsackie B5 as an important agent in causing aseptic meningitis. Polio came a little bit later. It's interesting. We had epidemics every year, and we were able to provide important information relating viruses to disease under investigation. And in 1957, there was a very interesting situation, as you remember, was a Asian influenza year. And the first, I guess the first situation that contributed to a spread of the virus was in Grinnell, Iowa, whereby a group of individuals convened together on the campus of Grinnell in July, and an outbreak of influenza occurred, and of course subsequently they disbanded the meeting, terminated the meeting, and the people left and scattered all over the United States. And as a result of that situation, Alice Langmuir established an influenza laboratory right at the Kansas City Field Station. And the epidemiologic investigation we conducted in 1957 contributed a great deal to the epidemiology of that disease. So then polio a bit later.
Would you say that the relationship with Herb Wenner at the university was an important contribution to the interest and work in enteroviruses, or was it really not that important?
Oh yes, it's no question about it. Without Herb Wenner's contribution, I don't believe we would have been able to identify ECHO4. He's the one really gave us reagents and tissue cultures and helped us to identify that the agents we were dealing with in the 1955 epidemic of aseptic meningitis in Iowa was indeed ECHO4. And also helped us in other ways. He helped us in polio investigations, and of course he himself had contributed a great deal in polio, in the area of polio.
He was a real pioneer in virology, wasn't he? Wasn't he one of the real first workers in what became known as the field of virology?
That's right. He's Herb Wenner coordinated all the laboratories, that is all tissue culture laboratory for identification of polioviruses during the salt vaccine trial.
He started at Yale, didn't he?
Well, he came from Yale. He was graduate from Yale, and then he went to Colorado. He took a year of pathology there before he came to Kansas.
And I understand he's still working.
He's still working, although he's retired, but he's still working a couple days a week. He's still active.
What about some of the other projects from the Kansas City Field Station, leukemia cluster studies and surveillance?
Well, yes, we were interested in leukemia, and when Clark Heath investigated his leukemia cluster in Illinois, we got interested in leukemia because we encountered a cluster of leukemia in Green Bay, Wisconsin, as well. We developed a working relationship with NIH, and hoping to find the agent of leukemia. But in order to conduct good epidemiologic studies, we organized a surveillance program, a population-based surveillance program in Kansas City, involving 6 counties. So I believe we conducted an epidemiologic study of leukemia for about 6 years. The objective was to identify possibility of clustering of leukemia in the area, but more important to find out what is the incidence of leukemia of various types, and the data that we had collected represent one of the earliest statistics showing that the incidence, that is population-based incidence of leukemia in a particular area. So I think although we did not spend a lot of time in working on leukemia, but at least we started on population-based studies in leukemia.
Tell me about the plague outbreak in Java in 1968. Was that primarily bubonic, or was there a pneumonic form as well?
Well, the outbreak in Java was also one of the largest outbreaks in the history, that is recent history of plague.
You led the team, as I recall.
Right. But it was it was bubonic plague, we had over 100 cases of plague, probably more that were not identified. But toward the latter part of the epidemic, there were we could identify 2 outbreaks, pneumonic plague in 2 villages, and we instituted preventive measures in order to control that. And if we hadn't done that, I think we would have a much more extensive occurrence of pneumonic plague.
What were those preventive measures?
We identified that the pneumonic plague was occurring in some of the families, and we gave tetracycline to every member of the village. There are 2 villages, and they tetracycline. We had tetracycline along with us, so we gave everyone tetracycline. I believe that was effective enough to prevent pneumonic spread.
What about you and your team? Did you have any concerns about coming down with plague yourself?
Not too much.
Did you take any?
Well, we received some vaccination, but I don't think it's really very effective. It's inactivated vaccine. I think we took some tetracycline, although I'm not sure how consistent we were.
At least none of you got sick.
None of us got sick.
Tell me about the cooperative mycosis project.
Well, the cooperative mycosis project grew out of chemotherapy of histoplasmosis. As you know, if you have a cavitary histoplasmosis or with disseminated histoplasmosis, patients eventually die from the disease. Dr. Ferkalow and his group was the first one that participated in testing of amphotericin B in the treatment of cavitary histoplasmosis and disseminated histoplasmosis. And in order to provide more information, Dr. Ferkalow developed cooperative studies with tuberculosis sanitarium in Texas, in Missouri, and a couple other places. The primary objective is to obtain enough patients to do good clinical trial for the treatment of disseminated and cavitary histoplasmosis.
How many different centers do you think were?
I don't remember. I would say 3 or 4 of them. I know that the one in Texas, there's one in Arkansas, one in Missouri. There may be another place, I don't quite remember, but there's several hospitals cooperated in that program.
And those studies were important in developing better means of treating histoplasmosis.
That's right. Not only in treating histoplasmosis, we were interested in other mycotic infections as well. Treatment of coccidioidomycosis. Oh, yeah, California. We had a collaborative relationship with the group in California in the treatment of coccidioidomycosis.
There was a lot of work with respiratory diseases. I know from my work with the Eskimos in Alaska, but tell us a little bit about the objectives of the respiratory disease studies and their extent.
Well, after we set up the laboratory for influenza, of course there were some new respiratory viruses emerging, the para-influenza viruses, and the NIH was interested in learning more about the occurrence of these viruses in different populations, and also to study various populations in order to have a base data for future vaccine studies. So we developed a working relationship with the NIH to study acute respiratory infection, viral infections in different communities. At first we population in Omaha, You were in Omaha, weren't you? No.
That's right, my first
yeah,
year.
Yeah, that's right. You were in Omaha. We were studying.
Cell and Gil Saliba.
That's right. We were studying acute respiratory infection in the one of the children's homes in Omaha. And later on, we were interested in finding out whether viral infection of the respiratory tract behaves similarly in the Arctic area. So, so we went up there and looked for a population. That's where I met Jim Menard, and looked for a population to do studies. And we ended up in Bethel. Although we looked into a couple other places in Alaska, but we ended up in Bethel. And we did a longitudinal studies in Bethel for about 7 years in a population, in Eskimo population in Bethel.
Yes, from my association with that study, I would say it was very interesting, although it was in a way too bad that we never had the vaccines to test. I think the study was nonetheless useful because, as I recall, we found that despite a very high death rate in children from respiratory diseases, the causes of those respiratory infections turned out to be the same as in other parts of the U.S. The actual incidence of respiratory viral infections was quite comparable to that, for example, from the Cleveland studies.
That's right, exactly the same, as a matter of fact.
It was really the complications which differed.
Right. Well, one of the major complications of acute respiratory infections among Eskimos, as you know, is a bronchiectasis. The frequency of bronchiectasis is much higher among children in that area, say, than in other states. And also that an other complication is otitis media and leading to hearing defects.
That's right. I recall that the frequency of draining ears in the first year of life was horrendous. And the study that was done by Jim Maynard and others on the ampicillin prophylaxis was interesting in that it showed you could reduce the incidence of otitis media with low levels of ampicillin, I think, in this case.
That's right. Well, actually, we contributed quite a bit of information to the particular parainfluenza viruses. In addition to the studies in Omaha and to the studies in Alaska, we did a longitudinal studies in one of the children's homes in Kansas City as well. As a matter of fact, I was talking with the anti-nomists yesterday. Now, you fellows really did one of the best studies on herpes simplex infections in one of the children's home. And I remember now that we did actually a longitudinal study of herpes simplex, that is oral, type 1 herpes simplex. And later on in Omaha, we did, in Kansas City too, we did a study of herpes simplex of type 2. Of course, at that time we didn't know it was type 2, but we did do some studies on the frequency of women excreting herpes simplex virus, cervical, from the cervical tract, the vaginal tract. So we contribute various types of studies, but I would say another area that I think we have contributed quite a bit was polio, as you mentioned earlier. The epidemic of polio in 1959 in Des Moines. There was another epidemic in Kansas City and another epidemic in Arkansas. And the Kansas City field station personnel investigated all three epidemics that year. And of course, we provided interesting data on oral pharyngeal excretion of a virus, which very little was known about that time. I looked up some of the publications of Herb Wenner in the early days when they did not have tissue cultures for isolation of polioviruses. They isolated in monkeys. He did some family studies, and what he did was he pooled all the specimens from the entire family and throat secretions as well as stools, and inoculated in monkeys. And when we were studying polio in 1959, of course, we had tissue cultures, and it was relatively simple to isolate polio virus from the oropharyngeal secretions. But no one really had good data on that. I think we're the first one that provided good data on the frequency of isolation of polio virus from oral secretion, as well as the duration of excretion of the virus in the oropharyngeal in the oropharynx.
Were you involved with the Cutter incident investigations?
Our station was, I was involved more with the salt vaccine trial. When the Cutter outbreak occurred, Ernie Chick was an EIS officer, a second-year EIS officer. He was assigned specifically to work on the Cutter vaccine incident.
Some of the other things that I recall having been done by the Kansas City field station included work on specific incidents of influenza in school populations, for example. Those papers which compared outbreaks in 57 and 68, I believe.
That's right.
Were quite interesting and are often quoted.
Well, we were lucky enough to study the same populations during two pandemics. In 1957, we studied the outbreak in one of the high schools. In addition to the high school population, we investigate the families as well.
By questionnaire.
That's right. And we were able to show that, actually the first epidemic, we were able to show that although the cases were centered in the schools, but there was evidence of intra-household spread. There was some suggestion of it, and they were found by others. As a matter of fact, some of the English workers were not able to show intra-household spread, and some people in Cleveland. Well, Bill Jordan, I think Bill Jordan was not able to show intra-household spread, but we had suggestion that was intra-household spread. Then when an epidemic of influenza B hit Iowa, in one of the communities in Iowa, and also in one of the communities in Missouri, we were able to show distinctly intra-household spread. And nobody really, well, some of the people didn't quite believe it. Didn't quite believe it was intra-household spread, but now I think it's quite clear. Almost everybody accepted that influenza spread after it's introduced into the household, it indeed spread into the household. And this is also true with with poliovirus infections. And there was very little information on spread of the virus from the oral secretion to another individual, rather than by fecal-oral transmission. In the Des Moines study, we were able to show distinctly that you can transmit by oral, the virus in oral pharyngeal secretion.
One of the other studies that I think was interesting had to do with cytomegalovirus. Colin Jordan and others, just before the Kansas City Field Station closed, were studying CMV, and I think that showing the changing patterns of CMV shedding in the cervix during pregnancy was interesting, as well as the studies of CMV infection among blood donors. That was quite a lot of work just before in the early 70s.
Yes, we got interested in CMV. Of course, the interest is pretty much dependent on I guess the current interest of certain viral infections at the time, as well as the interest of EIS officers assigned to the laboratory. There was a fellow named Cryle. I can't remember. Bob Cryle. He was interested in working in the laboratory. As a matter of fact, at first he was interested in work on multiple sclerosis. So I opened the laboratory to him, and he dabbled with growing glial cells from rabbits for a while, and tried to do some study on multiple sclerosis. Later on, I guess he got interested in cytomegaloviruses, because I had some isolation of cytomegaloviruses in the lab at the time. And he was interested in to see whether cytomegalovirus cause stillbirth or not. So he went and collected material from fetal tissues from women that had abortion, and he isolated a number of cytomegaloviruses from fetal tissues. Now, what is really etiologically related or not is still not quite clear, but I think there's some evidence cytomegaloviruses does cause abortions, and of course we could isolate the virus from the abortus material. And later on, we got interested in the possibility of cytomegaloviruses in blood transfusion. Of course, you could find the virus readily in leukocytes, and we collaborated with Bill Baer at a blood bank. And indeed, we were able to show the evidence of transmission of cytomegalovirus through blood transfusion. Although we were not, we were not the first one to show that,
no.
You know, but the other people are doing it, and we were interested in providing that kind of investigative experience for EIS officers.
I think that some of the seroepidemiologic studies of CMV showing the low prevalence of antibody in nuns, for example, compared with high rates of antibody prevalence in promiscuous females, was some of the early work in that area, as well as the work by Colin Jordan and others in documenting clearly the importance of CMV as a cause of infectious mononucleosis syndrome.
Yes, yes, I think Colin Jordan did some very nice work on relating CMV as a cause of infectious mononucleosis-like illness. And Larry Davis, I don't know whether you remember him or not, he's the one that in working on the prevalence of antibodies among nuns.
Yeah.
And he published that paper, and I think that was a very interesting paper, and showing indeed that CMV was probably transmitted by the sexual route rather than by the oral route.
Right. In what way do you think the collaboration between epidemiologic and laboratory work in the Kansas City Field Station was important or unique?
I think this is one of the most unique aspects of field station activities. From the very early days of Leo Ferkalow, he's established mycology laboratories and used that as a tool for epidemiologic study. We have this distinct advantage that you coordinate laboratory activities as well as field activities. I think it's very important. Not only that, the EIS officers were given opportunities to learn about laboratory techniques. They may not necessarily become expert virologists or mycologists, but they know enough about the laboratory that they can interpret the data, the field data, much better. And I think this is a unique aspect of all field stations that is within CDC, well, not only within CDC, it's NIH too. The Rocky Mountain Laboratory, for example, they were able to coordinate their field and laboratory activities in one place, under one roof.
It's interesting that this model of early collaboration between lab and epidemiology has really been followed here at CDC in Atlanta now in the recent reorganization in 1981. The epidemiology and laboratory aspects, for example, of infectious diseases are all under one roof. I think that perhaps you were an early model of that kind of organization.
I think we had some influence on that. There's no question we had some influence on it, because when I first got into CDC, of course, in epidemiology branch, and epidemiology branch at that time had no laboratories of its own, and all their investigations depended on laboratory branch. I remember one time that D.A. Henderson came out and visited me, and still in an old Quonset building. And I was doing a lot of work on enterovirus investigations. We processed a lot of stool specimens and oropharyngeal secretion and so on. And D.A. Henderson was assistant chief at the time, under Alex Lamier. He said, you know, Tom, you have such a good laboratory. We would like to send you specimens from Atlanta for you to process. So I look at D.A. Henderson and say, I don't want to process specimens that you sent to me because it has to be integrated under one and in one place. Why not, if you want to have somebody to process specimens, why not send it to laboratory branch? Of course, you know the reason for that. And shortly after that, they established their own laboratory.
Right.
Established a Staphylococcus and other bacteria, a laboratory for study of bacteria agents. So I think they saw the importance of having laboratory facilities integrated into their field investigations.
Yes, I think that at the time of the reorganization, there were some fairly good-sized laboratories working both in the old Bureau of Epidemiology and Bureau of Labs on very closely related areas. Of course, those have now been merged into single laboratories.
Well, actually, some other EIS officers had a similar advantage, not necessarily in field stations, but assigned to universities. When I first joined EIS, some of the assignments were in Joe Melnick's laboratory in Yale, in Dr. Francis' laboratory in Ann Arbor, University of Michigan, and also the laboratory at the University of Minnesota under Silverton. When you are assigned to those laboratories, you can learn laboratory work as well as doing investigations. So when I was assigned to the Kansas City Field Station in 1954, I was actually working in Dr. Winter's laboratory. I learned my tissue culture and learned my virology there in his laboratory.
Some of the people who've come through the Kansas City Field Station have stayed in infectious diseases, and I think, for example, of George Ray, who's had quite a successful career in virology. Colin Jordan is someone else who's continued his work with CMV. Are there others who've stayed in public health or infectious diseases that have come through your program?
Oh yes, a number of them. In addition to George Ray, and you mentioned Colin Jordan. Colin Jordan is at Minnesota now, by the way. Let's see, Sandy Lamb. Sandy Lamb is another one. Bob Cryle, of course, at the University of Minnesota.
Larry Davis.
And Larry Davis. Bill Marine. Some of them, I can't remember all of them, but there are quite a number of them.
Yes, it's quite a list.
Quite a number of them.
Burton Ruochet wrote up an outbreak investigation in a book called Medical Detectives. It had to do with an outbreak of histoplasmosis in 1955. Mm-hmm. Was it a fairly accurate representation of the events?
Oh yeah, actually he demanded original records. He was that kind of guy that he won't write anything unless he could see the records. We have to show him the original laboratory records that's showing that indeed that outbreak was histoplasmosis.
I understand he's still writing. He's just come out with another collection.
He's still writing, and I think he really had contributed a great deal in the annals of epidemiology.
Did he come to Kansas City to interviews?
Oh yes, he came and interviewed me and interviewed Leo Furcolo. He spent a couple of days here. Of course, that was his home. He came originally. He came from Missouri.
Really?
Yeah, he had his early experience in journalism in Kansas City at the Star. He worked in the Star.
That's interesting. Why do you think the Kansas City Field Station was closed?
Why the Kansas City Field Station was closed? I think it's probably multifactorial. I cannot be sure why, but one of the reasons is the reduction in budget. That's probably the primary reason, but maybe other reasons. We were told that around that time in 1973 that the CDC had to reduce its budget by 15%. But if you reduce the budget by 15%, why though pick on the Kansas City Field Station? And that there may be some basis behind that other than the budget. I think one of the problems is that even though people are interested in centralization from time to time, but when the pressure is on, decentralization doesn't mean very much. Now, the Kansas City Field Station, also EIP, I think EIP was a very successful program. All field station operations were extremely productive, and sometimes maybe a little bit too productive. Of course, I heard since the Kansas City Field Station was closed, I heard stories from different people say, well, you know, and when they were talking about why the Kansas City Field Station was closed, they said, well, you fellows were too productive, and maybe a little bit too independent, or maybe a little bit too threatened to some of the programs at the headquarters. Now, how much truth there is to that, I don't know. I think there is some truth to it.
And some of the areas were competitive or overlapping with some of the other programs, perhaps. There was respiratory virus work, for example, and CMV work, both in Kansas City and Atlanta, and some mycosis work in both areas.
Yes. The mycosis is quite different. The Kansas City Field Station in the area of mycosis is primarily epidemiologic investigations, whereas the mycotic investigations in, say, in Atlanta, for example, is primarily laboratory-oriented, identification of new fungi and so on. So, yes, there is some duplication, but a person really should investigate those infections in the area where those infections are prevalent. And histoplasmosis is one of them. Perhaps the Kansas City Field Station was closed is that maybe that the people here in Atlanta felt that we have learned enough about histoplasmosis. Maybe want to concentrate in some other areas.
The control program that the Kansas City Field Station had was unique, though, as I recall, the treatment of soil sites with bird roosts and that sort of thing. And that has, as I understand it, been resumed to some extent since the closure of the Kansas City Field Station after a hiatus. Is that?
Yes, actually, that's quite a number of epidemics of histoplasmosis occurred since the closure of the Kansas City Field Station. One of the major ones, actually one of the most recent ones in the recent years, but there were two major epidemics of histoplasmosis in the Indiana University. It was an extensive epidemic, and they were not able to identify at the beginning whether it was histoplasmosis or something else. And as a matter of fact, they had two epidemics, I guess two consecutive years, or maybe in 2 or 3 years, two epidemics in 2 or 3 years. And they were not able to isolate the agent from soil. I think if the Kansas Station were still actively working on histoplasmosis, I'm sure we would have been able to isolate the agent. It requires a certain amount of continuing interest in that area. And in Atlanta, the interest primarily trying to identify new fungi, whereas we were interested in identifying or isolating agents in order to support epidemiologic investigations. So the orientation is quite different.
Would you want to summarize what you see as the main contributions of EIP as a program within CDC?
The main contribution, I think the main contribution is that at least I was, or the people working with me, were able to upgrade the various field stations. And when I took over when we took over the Phoenix laboratories, for example, well, they were working on diarrhea, and they dabbled a little bit about hepatitis, but in general, the type of investigations they had was not at the level that I thought and other people thought was good enough. So so we upgraded the activities of the Phoenix field station, for example, became internationally known for its work on hepatitis. The work in schistosomiasis in Puerto Rico, for example, we, in addition to broaden its activities, we were able to develop facilities to work on dengue. And it is the only laboratory in the United States that work on dengue extensively at the present time. And the work in Alaska, so certainly to me, is fabulous. They were able to not working on infectious diseases, but work on cancer as well. They were able to identify diseases such as nasopharyngeal carcinoma among Eskimos. They were able to provide data on the relationship of EBV to nasopharyngeal carcinoma. So not only the investigations on various diseases, but I think perhaps the most important contribution is to show the importance of integrating laboratory facilities with field investigations.
You've had a lot of events in your life since 1973 when you left CDC. You've become a professor and the president of the American Epidemiological Society and a variety of things. Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing since 1973. That's 12 years ago. Well,
12 years ago, actually, I retired from CDC, or from Public Health Service, on October 1, 1973, and I went to work next day. And so I've been working ever since retirement. And I joined the University of Kansas. Of course, I was in their faculty since 1955 as a part-time faculty without, of course, compensation. But and I joined the Department of Human Ecology at the time. It was interesting. It was called Human Ecology, and coming from ecological investigations and fit in very well. Well, anyway, I've been there for about a year and a half or so, and I was appointed as acting chairman of the department. And later on, a year or so later, I became chairman. And I changed the major focus of the department from or whatever human ecology was to epidemiology. And so I had started investigations in not only infectious diseases. I had, as a matter of fact, I had a couple laboratories on the old CDC building. I just gave it up a few months ago. But I was doing work on the relationship between herpes virus and prostate cancer. And we were able to find that there was some relationship between herpes virus type 2 and cancer of the prostate. And since then, I have been working on, in addition to teaching and so on, I've been working on brain cancer. Some of my faculty members work on breast cancer. And I had also got in, well, I was put on as a hospital epidemiologist for about 10 years at the University of Kansas.
You've also worked on a number of study sections, or at least on some NIH study sections.
Yes, actually, I have been working in various study sections with NCI and NIH since 1973. I was initially working with as an ad hoc member in the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and later on, and I was appointed as a member of of Epidemiology and Disease, and Disease Control Study Section. I was there for 4 years. And you could not run consecutively from one study section to another. You have 1 year layoff in between. So I had 1 year off, but they still call on me as ad hoc members on the 5th year. And then in the 6th year, they appointed me again as a member in a contract. Actually, it's called the Biometry and Epidemiology Contract Review Committee. So I served that in that committee for 4 years. And now I'm on the committee for in this Cancer Center Review Committee. So I have been appointed for another 4 years.
And you've had various offices in other professional associations, the APHA, American Epidemiological Society, and others, as I recall.
Yes. I just finished my term as the president of the American Epidemiological Society, and I'm still the chairman of epidemiology section of APHA, and I will, I guess, by November, I finish my 2 terms, and I will become I guess, chairman of a nominating committee. When you serve 2 years as chairman of the epidemiology section at APHA. So I've been keeping pretty busy.
Sounds like it, but not much of a retirement.
Well, it's a good retirement in a way, but it's not a retirement, but a different orientation. It's different orientation.
Do you have any final reflections on your time with CDC or words of advice for CDC as it faces its future?
Well, as far as I was concerned, CDC was great for me. I think CDC is at least the time when I got in, I thought was a tremendous opportunity. When I got in, virology, I think at that time was a golden age of virology when I got in. I was fortunate because the use of tissue culture for isolation of viruses. There were so many different viruses isolated, and I had an opportunity to go to Kansas City, even though that's not my first choice. That was my 3rd choice, as a matter of fact, but turned out to be the first choice. I think CDC, as far as a place for training of epidemiologists, is great. The EIS program is excellent, and I don't hesitate to advise anybody really to go into the EIS program to get their training experience in epidemiology.
My choice or my assignment to Kansas City wasn't my first choice either. But I'm glad in retrospect because it opened a whole new world to me, assignments in Anchorage, and here I am 19 3/4 years later still with CDC, planning only to stay 2 years.
That's right. I was planning to stay for 2 years also, but turned out to be 19 years with CDC.
Well, Tom, it's been a real pleasure, and for me to talk to you today and for me to have worked with you when you were at Kansas City.
Well, it's my pleasure, indeed.